Hello, physiologists. Let's discuss what happens in the stomach. So, the stomach has a couple of different functions. Primarily, of course, it's going to mix all of your food with all of your secretions, those secretions that you had in your mouth that you swallowed, and also the secretions that are produced by the stomach. As your food and all of these juices blend together, you get what's called chyme. So at this point, it's technically not called food anymore, but now it's chyme. The stomach also functions as a reservoir to hold your food before you release it to the small intestine. And it's released in small little chunks, if you will. You're not going to completely unload your stomach contents into your small intestine all at once. So it is kind of a holding place for most of your food as you release it bit by bit. Your stomach also secretes gastric juice. What a fantastic name. And gastric juice is made of a couple of different things that the stomach secretes. You have hydrochloric acid, which is one of the reasons why the pH of your stomach is so low, especially when you are digesting food. Hydrochloric acid does a couple of different functions. It's effective at killing most bacteria, and it also denatures protein. Remember, protein has a three-dimensional shape to it, and so hydrochloric acid basically helps to start unfolding that protein. Pepsin is going to begin protein digestion as well, and we'll talk more about pepsin. Intrinsic factor is responsible for absorbing vitamin B12, which is important for creating red blood cells. Vitamin B12 is. And you also get gastric lipase secretion. Gastric tells you that it is secreted by the stomach. Lipase tells you that it digests lipids. Remember, anything that ends in ASE is an enzyme. So gastric lipase digests lipids or triglycerides. And then finally, your stomach also has some endocrine function. It secretes hormones, such as gastrin. So gastrin is a hormone that is secreted into your blood, and it helps to regulate digestion. There are four main regions of your stomach: the cardia, the fundus, the body, and the pylorus or pyloric region. And then you also have plenty of rugae, which are large folds of the mucosa. And so you can see this if we look to the next picture. So here is a general picture of your stomach. You see these folds on the inside? These are the rugae. And as your stomach fills with food, these actually flatten out to make more space. Your stomach has a pretty good ability to distend and become larger as it fills with more and more food. But you also have stretch receptors in there that help to tell your brain, oh, we're stretched out now, we don't need any more food. So for the main regions, the cardiac region is right here. It's just this narrow little region right where the esophagus attaches, right here. The fundus is this region over here. Fundus is a term that's used for the region farthest from the opening. And the opening we're looking at is way over here. This is the pyloric region over here, or the pylorus. And you can see the pyloric sphincter right here. The pyloric sphincter is important because it helps to make sure that the contents of the stomach stay in the stomach until the small intestine is ready. The contents of the stomach have a very, very low pH because of that hydrochloric acid we talked about, and you don't want to let that into the small intestine until the small intestine has had a chance to get its bicarbonate buffer ready. So you want to keep the contents of the stomach in the stomach. And remember, there's also another sphincter over here. You have the lower esophageal sphincter or cardiac sphincter. And so the contents of the stomach should stay in the stomach until they're ready to move on. This main part is the body of the stomach. And then parts of the body, you can see this outer covering has been taken away. All of your digestive tract organs, your GI tract organs, have the same four layers: the mucosa, submucosa, muscularis, and serosa. But you do have a modification to the muscularis right here, and that is an extra layer of the muscularis. So all of your GI tract organs have this longitudinal muscle layer. They all have this circular muscle layer. But the stomach has this extra oblique muscle. And this really helps with one of the stomach's ways that it helps with mechanical digestion, and that's gastric mixing. So one of the jobs of the stomach is to mix the food with all of the enzymes and all of the gastric juice. And this extra layer of muscle helps with all of the contractions of the stomach to help everything get mixed up really well. If we take a closer look at the histology of the stomach, you'll notice that the epithelium looks different than where we came from in the esophagus. The epithelium of the esophagus had stratified squamous epithelium, and the epithelium of the stomach is simple columnar epithelium. You also see that you have these pits in here. You go very far down, and then you come back up. Here is the lumen up here, and then you go very far down in here and come back up. So these are gastric pits. And within these gastric pits, you have specialized cells. And the specialized cells will produce different components of your gastric juice. But this is just showing how the stomach looks if you look at all these 4 layers. So here's the mucosa, this region right here. You have the lamina propria down here, muscularis mucosa. Underneath that you have the submucosa. Then you have 3 layers of muscle, and then finally the serosa will be the outermost layer. The gastric gland cells are responsible. They're located in those gastric pits, and these will secrete the components of your gastric juice. So we have chief cells. They are responsible for secreting pepsinogen and gastric lipase. Parietal cells secrete hydrochloric acid and intrinsic factor. When I see parietal, I think pH. Hydrochloric acid lowers the pH, parietal cells. Mucus cells, pretty obvious, they secrete mucus. You have some stem cells, and this is important because even though the stomach has some protections, it has some alkaline mucus to help protect itself, you still are going to damage the stomach lining quite a bit. And you're going to shed a lot of cells. So you do have some stem cells that are present that undergo a lot of mitosis to help replace and replenish those cells that are damaged or lost during the digestive process. This is also why during chemotherapy and radiation, these processes target rapidly dividing cells, including those in the hair and in the stomach. And this is why those patients who are undergoing chemotherapy frequently feel nauseous because their stomach lining is being damaged and they're not able to replace it as well. Finally, we have enteroendocrine cells. So entero is referring to your gut. Endocrine is referring to the endocrine system and hormones being produced. So enteroendocrine cells secrete hormones. So you've got G cells, which secrete gastrin into the bloodstream. And then all of these components together form gastric juice. Again, one more look at the histology of the stomach. So as you look into this gastric gland, all of these different types of cells are located there, and the different types of cells will produce different components, and then that gastric juice works its way back up and then enters the lumen up here to be mixed with all of your food that has entered the stomach. And then as it mixes, it becomes chyme. Notice you have great blood supply here. You've got lymphatic vessels, so your stomach is nicely set up. Your parietal cells are responsible for producing hydrochloric acid. And in another video, I go into this in a lot more depth, and I explain all of these processes in depth. But for this video, I'll just say that the parietal cells go through this equation you may be familiar with. You have CO2 plus H2O creates carbonic acid. Carbonic acid dissociates into bicarbonate ion, which you're going to save and send to your blood because it's a great buffer. And the hydrogen part goes to your stomach lumen. At the same time, you're shuttling in this chloride from your interstitial fluid and sending that to your lumen. And then you have your hydrogen and your hydrochloric acid that combine together to make hydrochloric acid. And so that goes into your stomach lumen. One of the benefits of creating the hydrochloric acid components separately and then letting them get together in the stomach lumen is so you don't damage your cells. You don't want to start unfolding the proteins of your cell. You just want to unfold the proteins of your food and start digesting those proteins. And so this is kind of a protective mechanism. Parietal cells will also secrete intrinsic factor in addition to hydrochloric acid. And this is important because it is required for vitamin B12 absorption. And vitamin B12 is necessary for the synthesis of hemoglobin. And so if you don't have B12, you can become anemic. The stomach is exposed to very, very low pH levels, as low as 0.8. If you took out some of your gastric juice and put it in a jar, you could dissolve nails with it. So your stomach needs some protection from that harsh pH. And so this consists of a couple of things. One is you have a bicarbonate-rich mucus that lines the stomach wall, so that alkaline mucus helps to protect against the acid that's being sent out into the lumen. Another thing that you see is tight junctions that connect the epithelial cells. So this helps to protect the rest of your organs and helps make sure that the acid and all of the other components of gastric juice remain inside the stomach and they're not allowed to get out. And then finally, those epithelial cells, if they happen to be damaged, they are shed very quickly and they are shuffled off into the lumen, and then they're quickly replaced based on mitosis from other stem cells. If you do happen to get that acid to breach that mucosal barrier, then that causes inflammation, which is called gastritis. Anytime you see gastro, that is referring to the stomach. So gastritis is inflammation of the stomach. If you have enough inflammation where you erode part of the stomach wall, like you can see here, here's normal, and then here's a peptic ulcer on the right side. That erosion is a peptic or gastric ulcer. And there's a danger here if you perforate the stomach wall, if you bore a hole all the way through, now all of your gastric juice with all of your enzymes and that low, harsh pH has access to your other organs. Most of the time, the vast majority of the time, this is caused by a bacterium called Helicobacter pylori. It is one of the rare bacteria that can actually survive in that harsh pH. And so frequently, you can just treat peptic or gastric ulcers with antibiotic and they go away. There are some cases where it can be caused by stress or if you eat a lot of acidic foods, but mainly they're just caused by this pesky bacteria that likes to live in very acidic conditions. So for mechanical digestion that the stomach participates in, we've already talked about this a little bit. You have mixing waves, gastric mixing. So every 20 seconds or so, you have peristaltic movements, and this helps to break down the food, and it mixes that food with the gastric juice. And don't forget that there is an enzyme that was secreted in the mouth, your salivary lipase or lingual lipase that was swallowed, and that also is going to begin working in the acidic pH of the stomach. When your food has sat in the stomach for long enough, and it's been digested down to some smaller components, you'll begin gastric emptying. And so each peristaltic wave will force a little bit of that chyme into the duodenum, which is the first part of the small intestine. The stomach has two main ways that it helps to digest proteins. One with hydrochloric acid and the other with pepsin. So hydrochloric acid's job is to denature the protein and start to unfold that three-dimensional shape. As an additional benefit, it can also stimulate the secretion of the hormones that tell the pancreas and your liver and your gallbladder to start stimulating the flow of their juices, bile and pancreatic juice, and start sending those to the small intestine. So basically, hydrochloric acid helps tell your body, get ready, we're going to have chyme in the small intestine soon, let's get ready. So for protein digestion, hydrochloric acid's job is just to denature it. But it doesn't actually cleave any of those bonds, the peptide bonds that are holding the proteins together. That falls to pepsin. Pepsin will actually sever the peptide bonds. as a form of protection for the stomach because you don't want severing of the peptide bonds of your organs, of your stomach. It is secreted in an inactive form called a zymogen. And so the zymogen's name is pepsinogen. And so the component that's actually secreted is pepsinogen. And then as pepsinogen moves into the lumen of the stomach and mixes in that more acidic environment with hydrochloric acid, pepsinogen gets turned into pepsin. And so pepsinogen can turn into pepsin either by hydrochloric acid or by already active pepsin. And so hydrochloric acid will kind of start unfolding those proteins. It denatures the proteins. And then pepsin is responsible for actually cutting those peptide bonds and starting to get some of those smaller dipeptides and tripeptides separated from the rest of that polypeptide. So here's a picture showing the action of pepsinogen and pepsin. So here is your parietal cell that secretes hydrochloric acid. Here is a chief cell that secretes pepsinogen. And then as this pepsinogen, which again is inactive, it's not going to be cutting any bonds in this form, as that pepsinogen comes in contact with hydrochloric acid, you take off a piece of it, and the rest is your activated pepsin. And so this one is ready to go, ready to cut off amino acids and cut those peptide bonds. And so here's your dietary proteins from what you ate. And now you can see those are cut up into smaller parts. You have some digested protein. As far as absorption in the stomach, only a little bit can be absorbed in the stomach. The vast majority of absorption will take place in the small intestine. But you can start moving some components from the lumen of the stomach into the bloodstream, which is what absorption is. So you can absorb some water, some ions, some short-chain fatty acids. Certain drugs are absorbed in the stomach, like aspirin, which is why if you read the back of the bottle on any NSAIDs, nonsteroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, like aspirin, Aleve, ibuprofen, they all say don't take it chronically, don't take it if you are at risk for peptic ulcers or anything, because these are absorbed in the stomach. And then alcohol also is absorbed in the stomach, which is why if you drink alcohol on an empty stomach, you'll feel the effects very quickly, compared to if you consume alcohol with food in your stomach. It takes longer for that digestion to occur, it takes longer for that absorption to occur, and you'll feel the effects more slowly. Within about 2 to 4 hours, the stomach has emptied its contents. If your meal was primarily carbohydrates, then it will work very quickly and your stomach will empty more quickly. And if your meal was heavier in fats, then it will take a little bit longer for your stomach to digest those all the way through. Let's talk about some of those enteroendocrine cells. So you do have hormones that are secreted by the stomach. You've got different gut-brain peptides. So these are peptides that help to communicate what's going on in the stomach with the brain. And so you've got substance P, which is for pain. You've got VIP, vasoactive intestinal peptide. You've got gastric inhibitory peptide, cholecystokinin, and neuropeptide Y. These are all secreted by the stomach.